Welcome to the final session for today's conference. I'm Linda Fletcher, a Legal Director in the Planning, Environment, Energy and Infrastructure team at Pinsent Masons. So what we've heard today is of great relevance to our practice and the legal challenges on the horizon we face day to day for all our clients. We're delighted to have hosted the EiC Annual Conference today and, of course, to chair this final panel session. With me are Louise, Ellison, Head of Sustainability at Hammerson, Simon Clennell-Jones, an Associate at ARCADIS, EC Harris, and Euan McVicar at General Counsel at the Green Investment Bank, was also ex-Pinsent Masons. We're going to hear brief presentations from our three panellists as to how, in their roles, they approach the question of delivery of green infrastructure and what key proposals they may have heard today or not from the party political broadcasts that we have heard as of being effective in unlocking the delivery of green infrastructure in the future. We'll then take questions from the floor after all of the three presentations. So please have your questions ready, and we will do our best to answer them. So I'm going to ask Louise first to speak about developers' perspective under the current policy regime, or investors' perspective, and how to deliver sustainable development, the drivers behind that approach, and how green goals are perhaps determined within your organisation and the barriers to that you face. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Hammerson, as some of you may or may not know, we're a property company, we're a REIT, we hold specifically retail assets, shopping centres and retail parks here and in France. We are a developer holder, so we develop assets and we hold and asset manage them. So there's effectively, I suppose, 4 different strands of our business in which sustainability has different kinds of impacts and in which our material impacts are different. So we have a development chain, we have an asset management chain, we also invest because we are investors in our own assets and other businesses, and obviously we have a corporate responsibility side of the business as well. We're a FTSE 100 company, so we are very much caught up in very careful reporting and transparency. So there are lots of different ways in which we're impacted by sustainability generally. More specifically, thinking about infrastructure, there are, I suppose, 3 or 4 different areas in which where I really think about infrastructure and how infrastructure impacts us, and some of the challenges that we have. So for me, infrastructure is, to start with, it's about accessibility. So our shopping centres are only really ultimately as good as the number of people they manage to get into them. We can have a conversation and debate about sustainability and consumption another time. I don't think that's one for this forum. But ultimately, people have to be able to get to our centres. So there's a huge issue around transport infrastructure. People largely, I mean, in our biggest, we've just done a footprint study, a carbon footprint study of the business, and by far and away, if you look at our Scope 3, visitor transport to our centres is our biggest material impact. So how do we resolve that? We're not about to resolve the problems of the combustion engine. That's absolutely not within our gift, and that's somebody else's problem to deal with. People are always going to drive to our centres, but we can offer alternatives, and we do certainly need a robust transport infrastructure in terms of public transport, trains, local transport, information about local transport, and continued delivery of local transport to support getting people into those centres, and also some clarity around new forms of transport. So, electric car charging infrastructure, car sharing, different forms of ownership. I think ownership of transport will change fundamentally over the next generation, as there are kind of different approaches and people expect different things from the forms of transport that they have access to. So that's one area which I think is very interesting, one which we will be looking at challenges. The assets we are building and extending now, Hammerson built the Brent Cross Shopping Centre 30 plus years ago. We still own it. We're expecting it to own it for the next 30 years. We're expecting to double its size over the next kind of 10 years. So these are assets that we hold for a long time, and that we are, as we're designing them now, we're thinking how they're going to be performing in 30, 40, 50 years' time. What is the society that they're going to be operating in going to look like then? Transport will, I suspect, be quite different. We'll have different issues to deal with. So that's one area of infrastructure. Another is the energy infrastructure. So one of my key risks is, over the next 30 to 40 years, how do we keep the lights on in our centres? That's fairly fundamental because it's quite difficult to shop in the dark. you come home with some strange stuff. Obviously, energy efficiency and reduction of the amount of energy that's used by our centres is key. Technology, we changed largely it's the lighting in our centres that is the biggest environmental impact in terms of their operation. Our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, it's the lighting that's the big take there. So trying to reduce those emissions, and technology has helped us there. We are now able to put in LED lighting, which significantly reduces the emissions from our centres, and that's got shorter and shorter paybacks, and technology has helped. But ultimately, our centres really need to be generating energy, and this is true of our retail parks particularly. We need to be generating energy from our assets, not them just consuming. One of the challenges we have with that is the grid infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So we are already having problems if I want to put big PV arrays on our big roofs on our retail parks. Actually, the grid locally is saying we can't take that energy into the grid. There's not the capacity within the local grid to take it. So those barriers we're beginning to hit, which I wasn't anticipating, but that's come up very quickly. Actually, the national grid needs to be invested in to make sure it's fit for purpose. But if we are going to, and businesses are very happy to start looking at how we generate, it's not necessarily central to Hammerson's business, but that's clearly something that we want to do. But we need to have a local infrastructure that will have the capacity to take that. And then there's digital infrastructure. So retail is changing. We're very, very aware of how the retail model is, the fact that it's going to change. Nobody can really predict the way we're going to be shopping in the next 10, 15, 20 years. All we know is it's going to be different from how it is now, and retailers are going to need to operate differently. So all we have is operating platforms from which those retailers run their businesses. So we need to be able to support them in doing that. And we need very, very strong digital infrastructure around those cities, around those centres that we have, in order to be able to make that work. Okay. So I don't necessarily see, I don't think it's terribly fair to expect the people who are kind of talking on this platform today to solve all of those problems for us, but those are the kinds of issues and the barriers that we need to see some pretty strong leadership and direction of challenge on over whoever, whatever the colour or hue of the political parties in office.
Thank you, Louise. And I think that just highlights the practical issues that you have to deal with day in, day out. I don't think we've got any of the politicians left in the room, but no doubt we can ask them as a separate question. Simon, you're going to focus, I think, today on brownfield land, and it could be an argument that that's perhaps not as sexy as energy efficiency, although I wouldn't think that, as an underused resource. And we heard Lord de Morley sort of touch upon contaminated land and the challenges for bringing that forward, those surplus assets for redevelopment. And you'll look, I think, briefly within that, challenges in relation to the skill set that we might need for bringing that forward.
So I'm Simon Clennell-Jones. I'm with ARCADIS. We're a leading global natural and built environment consultancy, working in areas of infrastructure, water, environment and buildings. And my focus is around the environment. I will try my best to make brownfield sound sexy. So don't want to build you up too much. So most of my work involves working in relation to redeveloping brownfield across the country. It's actually a resource that we can consume faster than we currently are. We're just not using it quick enough. We're actually, when I look at it, in the middle of a long-running housing crisis. We're in a situation where we need to put a lot more infrastructure in. There's a lot of building that needs to be done, and I think brownfield is where most of this needs to be, where it's appropriate. To put some numbers against things, so between 2001 and 2011, population in England grew by 4 million, and we managed to build 1.4 million homes. In 2013, we only built 112,000, and over the same period, the actual number of new households was 221,000. So what we have essentially is a housing crisis that's been going on for a long time. I'm sure people have seen it in the papers. Part of the results of that is positive for some people. House prices going up by 21%. Nationally, that's in London, nationally around about 6%. And I think that comes back to some of the things that were talked about earlier in terms of engagement of people in society. You've got a younger generation who can't afford housing. Why are they going to be too worried about the local community and environment if they're only in a place for a year and moving somewhere else a year? You've got issues around tenure, which is a wider social issue that plays into the importance of housing and the environment. Recent research that's been done has actually identified there's sufficient brownfield at this point for 1 million new homes. So that there's 1 million new homes of brownfield land identified. I'm not saying it's all in the right place. That doesn't include sites which are in current use. About 40% of that actually has planning at this point in time. So there's clearly a load of land there. And from what we've heard today, there's certainly a desire from politicians to think about brownfield land. It wasn't touched on as much as it has been at recent conferences, but there is definitely this push for housing, and almost every other politician, when he says housing, says brownfield. So we've been pushing this for a while. Why isn't it happening? I think, as everyone's broadly in favour of it, we need to really crack on and get it done. There's been some reporting which implies that one of the challenges with brownfield, one of the reasons it's not coming forward is barriers to development, such as accurate data on its actual location and ownership, and costs of remediation. Now, on the location and ownership details, unfortunately, they've now stopped reporting, compulsory reporting to the National Land Use Database. So the quality of data we're getting is now going to go down. Costs of remediation is actually something which is within our gift as an industry to really take hold of. We've made some massive technological leaps in terms of our remediation capabilities and our approaches to remediation, moved away from really simple measures such as dig it out and dump it somewhere else, towards much more sophisticated approaches. And I think that's something that we've got to keep pushing. We really need to be engaged in this process. Working outside of that, I think there's brownfield which isn't in the public domain, that is held by businesses and companies. They have a lot of concerns around their environmental liabilities. There's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, of remediation costings and potential implications. And actually, there's potentially, there could be a lot more land released for development. If we think about that in terms of the greenfield versus brownfield side, I think driving brownfield is pretty important. I do have some reservations on the importance of brownfield in policy, and I think that's something that is probably outside of this debate. Where I'd really like to really push is that if we can get better at remediating these sites, we have a gain in terms of overall people's human health, their exposure to contaminants. We have a gain in terms of resolving social issues. And actually that might mean that people are more engaged around things like the environment because they've got a home, they've got somewhere they actually live. One thing I would like to touch on, though, is I see a bit of a challenge in coming up over the horizon, and that's around the skills. So we had a drop-off in people coming into the industry to reflect the recession a few years ago. We're now seeing a bit of a shortage of people, and in fact, in the areas of house building, I know outside of the environment industry, there is a real shortage of people in house building in the southeast. So I don't know whether we've got the capacity to deliver the homes, let alone the rest of the infrastructure that we need.
Euan, how can the GIB fulfil its role in helping the UK meet its environmental policy objectives and deliver green infrastructure? And what are the barriers that you see in fulfilling that role? We heard earlier today a little bit of debate about allowing GIB to have borrowing powers. So I think maybe you can touch on that as well. That would be very useful for the audience.
Okay. Well, I'll maybe come back to the question of borrowing powers towards the end, but how we can help in the policy objective. Well, I suppose why were we set up in the first place? We were set up as a policy tool to help try and deal with a perceived gap in the liquidity of the financing markets for green and environmentally friendly projects. And we've certainly found that we have been needed in the market to deliver on that. And not just, the name bank suggests that we're typically involved in providing debt. We're really not much of a bank because we don't have any borrowing powers, like banks tend to have to borrow from other banks. We're not regulated by the PRA, and we don't take any deposits. But the one thing we do have in common with a bank, or what banks used to do anyway, is we lend money. Yeah. But we don't just do the lending of money, we also invest in equity, and that can be straightforward share capital, or it could be preferred equity positions, and we also take sort of mezzanine loans as well as senior debt. So we can play anywhere in the capital structure, depending on what's right for a project and where there's a need for us to be participating. But the whole question for us of whether environmental concerns are being properly addressed has sort of two main facets, I would say. First of all, the way that we are set up, we are only able to make investments or lend money where we can demonstrate that doing so will meet one of 5 statutory green purposes that we have that are set out in the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act, which set us up and are enshrined in our Articles of Association, and which can only be changed by a positive resolution of both Houses of Parliament. And so, there is, we have to fulfil one of these 5 green purposes. We have to be able to show that our action will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, will increase natural resource efficiency, will protect or enhance the natural environment, or protect or enhance biodiversity. and promote, or the last one is promote environmental sustainability. So it's a pretty broad church of green purposes, but we have to be able to demonstrate that. And we take that very seriously when we're making investment decisions. So all the way through our investment committee process, when we're looking at projects, we are assessing whether we are comfortable that any given opportunity that comes to us will meet one of those green criteria, and we understand how much it's likely to deliver towards the fulfilment of that. So we need to sort of have a very good idea as to what the project will be likely to deliver. And if we didn't do that, we would be acting ultra vires. So it's very important, and it goes to the core of what we've been set up to do. But the other area where environmental matters come to the fore for us is, again, when we're looking at investment decisions, is making sure that environmental matters have been handled appropriately and sensibly in any project, because we have been, we have certainly elected to take the position where that we are, as well as demonstrating that projects are green and meet one of our green criteria, we have to be very confident that they are going to be a commercial return.
Okay.
Now that's partly because of the way that we're set up under state aid rules. We have to be able to demonstrate we're making investments on a commercial term. But we also strongly believe that the best way we can fulfil our mission of crowding capital into the space is to show other investors that you can make money and good returns from green projects. So in making sure that a project has been well structured, is dealing with environmental risks appropriately, is another very important part of our investment committee process, where we were assessing and reviewing. And in doing that, we will work very closely with technical advisors and environmental consultants, and we want to see the sponsors and developers that we're working with acting with good technical advisors and good environmental consultants to make sure they're taking account of the risks. We've had a number of projects that have come to us over the last 18 months, 2 years, where the right consenting package has not been in place, or where people have been accepting of conditions that they don't really have a good mechanism for looking to discharge, and where we've had to work quite creatively with people to come up with solutions to find a way to see how the project is actually going to operate with a particularly difficult condition. And sometimes we find people haven't been perhaps robust enough in explaining why that's going to be a problem when they've been having discussions with the relevant authorities, and that can be something we have to spend quite a bit of time on. I was quite interested by your remarks on energy efficiency. We're finding that to be certainly the area that has the biggest potential of all the sectors that we're looking at, but it's quite difficult to get the scale of projects and get people interested in it. Some energy consumers are much more interested in it than others, but there seems to be a growing sense amongst the consumers, rather than people who have been perhaps sponsoring these projects and seeking to develop them, that there is something to be done here, that it can save money, and it's just a generally sensible thing to do, and it is also plays to people's wider sustainability policies, which are becoming more widely adopted. So that's an area where we think there's a lot more to do. There's lots of individual mechanisms and support schemes and places where people can go for advice, but it's very disparate. So we would like to see a bit more of that coming together, being easier for people to find out where they can get help about how to structure energy efficiency projects. And the contaminated land issue in brownfield sites is an interesting one for us. A lot of the projects that we get involved in are built on brownfield land, and that's good, we welcome that. But it can bring liability questions with it as well, and quite often some of those title issues you mentioned as well, where it's not always clear who has been responsible for any contamination, who carried out remediation works in the past, or whether a project company we would be lending to would have some liability that we need to be comfortable about. So we often spend quite a bit of time discussing those issues with insurance advisors as well, to try and make sure there's an appropriate package to back that up. We're very conscious there has been, and there always has been, a bit of a political debate about whether GIBs should have borrowing powers or not. As far as we're concerned, it's not something which keeps us awake at night at the moment. We've got 3.8 billion of committed funding from government, of which 1.6 billion we've committed so far. We managed to crowd in just over 5 billion of capital in total into the sectors we've been investing in, so in addition to our 1.6. But we've still got plenty of committed capital available to us from government, from the original 3.8. So the need to go out and borrow is not pressing. But our shareholder, which is UK government, has said to us that one of the things that we're tasked with doing is becoming a sustainable and enduring financial institution. And so at some point in the future, that's going to mean having access to capital markets or borrowing powers at some point. But right now, it's not a pressing concern for us.
That's very useful to know. Thank you. So thank you, Louise, Simon and Euan. So now it's your opportunity to raise questions of our three experts on the panel.
Roger Venables again from SQL, but this isn't a SQL question or a SQL-related question. It seems to me that in a lot of the infrastructure areas, whether we're planning them, financing them, or supplying skills, we're really not very good at deciding how to achieve the greatest good with the minimum adverse impact on the minimum number of people. We're not even very good in deciding who should decide that. And I just wondered if the panel members had any contributions that they would care to share with us on this challenge. I do come from this question from a essentially civil infrastructure area, and their scale, their impact in the landscape, their impact on people who maybe, because of their scale, don't get any benefits. So you end up with the benefits accruing to one part of the population and all the disbenefits accruing to another part of the population. And this seems to me to be a pretty difficult social disconnect to solve. And I'd welcome your views.
It was ever thus, wasn't it, with large infrastructure projects? I mean, it's for us, I suppose, take a case in point, for example, Brent Cross. In order for us to develop Brent Cross, there's a huge infrastructure project that's got to go on around that site. The number of parties that will be involved in that process, which is absolutely appropriate, is extensive. It's obviously TfL are involved in that process. Sorting out where the risk most properly lies, who should be holding that, who has control of the project, who doesn't, is an incredibly difficult jigsaw puzzle to try to solve, and I'm certainly not going to even begin to suggest that I would know where to start. All I do know is that those problems are, I suppose, there are kind of organisations, forums in place to enable us to resolve that, but it certainly it slows down the whole process of getting a development started. And I mean, Brent Cross has been kind of in the development pipeline for years and years and years. It kind of goes through cycles, you know, as big projects like that do. It's a big challenge, and it's hugely expensive. I think to some extent there can be expectations from potentially from public sector. There can be some naivety about exactly how challenging that sort of project can be for a private sector company. You know, there's no way Hammerson is in a position or should be expected to deliver a giant infrastructure project. But we're very much a party to it and at the table and trying to make sure that we can kind of bring these things along and bring people together. But it's tough. And, you know, of course, people in the community need to have their views recognised, understood, and as far as we possibly can, you know, make sure that we're providing something which actually benefits. I mean, as a business, we're wanting to make sure that whatever we bring to a community like that is net positive. We want to actually be bringing good into that community because we've got to keep those people wanting to come into that centre. We want that development to be generally positive for the local area. But trying to balance those things is difficult, and I don't think anybody would be a fool to say that they could actually come up with an easy solution to doing that. It's a tough problem, so it should be hard.
Peter Atchison, I run a contaminated land specialist company, but I also chair the EiC Contaminated Land Working Group. Simon, I wrote down some of the figures which you talked about. I'm not going to put you on the spot particularly, except to ask everybody up there, in actual fact, related to the amount of brownfield land which we have available and perhaps the desirability or motivation of some of our house building and indeed industrial commercial building organisations out there, given the new planning regime. In an area where we had builders in the summer quoting very, very good results and openly on national radio explaining that this was because the current government had reduced the confines, restricting them to building on brownfield sites. And we have the National Planning Policy Framework now, certainly in some of our opinions, being nothing like as strong as the policy which preceded it, do you feel that there is actually that drive amongst the clients, the house builders, and indeed perhaps the industrial clients sitting up there to redevelop and continue to redevelop these brownfield sites? Or are we seeing a stampede for the greenfield sites?
I'd suggest there certainly has been a move back towards greenfield, especially over the past few years. And from a personal point of view, I think that's regrettable. I think brownfield land is where we really should be focused. I do recognise that in some locations, brownfield land may be limited or completely unviable, and there's a growth requirement for housing there. But that is the classic situation where you have to balance the local need and that sort of policy piece. But I do think, yes, we're probably doing more on greenfield than we should. I would like to see all the brownfield supply used up. However, based on the national land use data, what's actually happening is the amount of brownfield land is being recycled in. So I think I've got some numbers somewhere which I'll chat you through later, and all the source of my numbers. But as land is being developed out, land is coming back into that brownfield register. And bearing in mind that's just a register of what's known about by local authorities, it doesn't include all the potential redevelopment sites that big organisations are sitting on. I think one of the things that I have as a concern is working with several large organisations who do not have property as a key part of their strategy. They're often sat on surplus assets which could help solve some of these problems, but they just don't see that opportunity there. And actually there's probably a role in promoting land in a slightly different way, in the fact that these are probably not necessarily all liabilities, they may be assets. How can we bring those forward as assets for those organisations?
What I'm seeing going through the investment committee is that quite a lot of the projects are on brownfield sites. That's potentially perhaps a bit more skewed for us because we are looking at a lot of projects where there is some industrial heat demand, and so it makes sense that they're happening on brownfield sites. And a lot of the waste projects, the smaller waste projects as opposed to the big set piece PFI, PPP projects, are using brownfield sites as well for waste to energy projects. So we are seeing a reasonable amount of it. And as I said, it does, it can cause issues, but there's nothing that's, unsurmountable with the right approach being taken.
It can be managed.
Yeah.
I think also with the updated national planning policy on waste, that is saying, local authorities and private investors should be looking for the waste facilities on brownfield land first. So moving away from the green belts, I think that will be encouraging going forward. And this gentleman here.
What would you most like as GIB from next election by way of policy changes from government?
I suppose what's important for us in order to be able to deliver on our mission is to make sure there are going to be enough bankable and investable projects out there. So I think there has to be clarity over policy. There has to be enough clarity to encourage people to be developing projects and be spending money on development expenditure. Some of the projects that we're looking to invest in have got very high levels of development that's needed before you get to the point you can bring in GIB. So people need to feel confident in whatever government of whatever colour it is we have next, that it's going to be committed to allowing those types of projects to be developed. So certainty and clarity and commitment to the space is what we would like to see more than any particular policy change. It's more a broader sense of comfort, I would say. We've got a pretty good relationship with all of the political parties, I think, and we have regular dialogue with all of them. For GIB, I think at the right time we would want to have access to whether it's capital markets or borrowing powers. That probably at some point in the lifetime of the next Parliament, maybe not immediately, but yeah, some ongoing understanding. As the Chancellor in his last year's autumn statement had said that GIB needed to be on a path to bringing private capital into the organisation, and we see that as another good way of being able to attract capital into the sector more generally. So we'd obviously be keen to understand whether any new government continued to share that goal of that the Chancellor stated last year. So understanding what that holds for us would be important.
Matt Gailey, Chair of EiC's Air Pollution Working Group. Some of us are old enough to remember when we had thriving town centres. Some of us who live in the north of the country. And in my own town, actually, we've just seen a big new, well, probably the fourth big new development of an out-of-town shopping centre, and further denuding of the town centre and more charity shops going in. And I'm just wondering, and the rate of building of these centres seems to outstrip even the population increase that we've heard about earlier. And I just wonder, for two questions really. First of all, in the planning of these out-of-town shopping centres, how big a role does sustainability and the economic factor, weigh against the pure commercial aspirations of the companies who invest in those centres and who occupy those centres? And secondly, do we think we're ever going to see a return to town centre shopping?
I don't think town centre shopping was just confined to the north. I think town centre shopping is going on all over the country and is still going on now. So with regards to the kind of shopping centres that we have in towns, town centre shopping is critical to them thriving themselves. So there is a sort of, quite often companies like ours get a lot of mud thrown at us about, that we're destroying town centres with our shopping centres. It's simply not the case. There's a huge amount that a well-run, well-invested in shopping centre will bring to a town centre. And you may not have the same, you don't necessarily want to have the same retailers in your shopping centre as you do on your high street. And really the high streets need to be thinking about how they bring different types of retailers and provide space for different types of kind of entrepreneurial activity that's going on, and that's happening. That is sort of beginning to happen. There are undoubtedly challenges in a lot of that high street retail, but that's just going to be the part of the evolution of retail shopping. We need to find a way to resolve that. Shutting a shopping centre down isn't going to solve that problem at all. So for the shopping centres within the towns, I think they're certainly symbiotic with the retail high street. Our centres thrive where we've got really effective, thriving shopping streets around them, which people will come to. That's what draws people in, and we want more and more people to come. So we have very good relationships largely with the local authorities and with the town centre management communities that work alongside us. With regards to out-of-town shopping centres, and we have a retail park portfolio, a big retail park portfolio in this country, and we have retail parks in France as well. And your question about to what extent does environmental considerations come into our investment in retail in the retail parks, and they certainly do. We are in the process of developing one of our retail parks, which will be built to BREEAM Excellent. So there's a lot of the environmental side is certainly considered where we develop those retail parks, and the challenge around trying to make sure that we're not just pulling retailers out of the nearby town centres is undoubtedly an ongoing one. Retail parks traditionally tended to have retailers on them which don't necessarily occupy the high streets. So where we have big box retailers on retail parks, they're not necessarily the same retailers that are on the high street. So you're providing a different offer. You're also providing a different type of retailer. So our retail parks we very much see as convenient shopping for people. You're coming to retail parks, and I use retail parks, as many of us do, for different types of shopping than that I do in a town centre or a retail high street. So I think you have to sort of start to look at it as there are different ways in which people use different types of area for their shopping. And there is a lot of, with regards to how many of them are being developed, I don't know the extent to which there are lots and lots more retail parks being developed in out-of-town sites. The planning provision was for town centre first, so certainly there should be much more of a focus around, as far as I'm concerned, that is happening, that focus around town centre not having so much. And there is certainly been a restriction on the amount of out-of-town shopping centre that has been developed. So I'm not sure that I agree that there's a huge amount of this being developed out of town and that's kind of dragging stuff out of the existing town centres. But there is undoubtedly a role to play for the different types of retailing that happen, which we all participate in. And to be to feel that one is necessarily is particularly going to threaten another, simply I don't think is the case, and it shouldn't be seen as one threatening the other.
This morning we had a representative from the Trillion Fund speaking. She was very interesting, and she made the point that it would be very useful to connect the general populace with green investment, in particular the ability to invest into large schemes to see some form of rate of return. I think, if I pick this up correctly, my father's the accountant, not me, she was suggesting that there should be an ability to have sort of investment products within the Green Investment Bank that the community could, at large, the populace of the UK could invest in some ways and look at a rate of return from a green investment. Is that something that you see as being possible, desirable?
It's certainly desirable, first of all, I think, because I think to get the general population engaged through investment with these projects would help address some of the concerns that you sometimes hear when people feel that they're paying lots of subsidies through their electricity bill, but not really seeing anything that's impacting them. They see returns going to large utility developers, but nothing that's sort of involving the population as a whole. So I think it would be a good way of getting a bit of an engagement with the general community going. So I think there's definitely scope for it. So we have been looking at and discussing with a number of different organisations the potential for some form of crowdfunding type of product that we could be involved in, either administrating or co-investing with. It's early days yet on that front. Some of the other voices out there, in addition to Julia's, have been suggesting that perhaps what's really required is some form of green ISA, where people would be given some form of specific tax advantage if they did, just like a normal ISA, but to say that if you invested in this, you would get a tax benefit, so it would encourage people to invest in that, and so you're bringing the general population's savings to bear to help deliver something which is seen as desirable in policy terms as well. We think that's also quite an interesting role. There's quite a few financial services issues that would have to be overcome in order to be able to do that, and for us, going from investing alongside commercial, wholesale, sophisticated professional funders to doing something which is a retail investment product. There's quite a lot to think about and put in place, but conceptually we think it's a really interesting idea in whatever manifestation, and it's something we are looking into and exploring just now.
And would that fit into one of those 5 criteria that you were?
Well, I think it definitely
would.
I think it would. I think you could argue, in itself, regardless of what the underlying investments were doing, that was helping to promote environmental sustainability, because it's getting people directly engaged and thinking about the issues. And yeah, absolutely.
Because that question all arose from sort of making energy efficiency sexy and that public engagement. We had another question this morning in relation to what were the sticks for energy efficiency, or did we need some more sticks for energy efficiency? They were talking about all the incentives. But I don't know, I've discussed with Louise before about the minimum energy efficiency standards, which we may or may not see before the next election, as well as CRC and ESOS. And how much of an influence has that been on your business?
Oh, huge. I mean, it's quite funny. Minimum energy performance standards, which were mooted, we were told they were coming, and they've been proposed for 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah.
Yes. Now. And arguably, their most significant impact has been on their announcement that they're coming.
Yes.
It's sort of more even than if they'd just simply been implemented straight away. So the fact that we know they're coming, nothing got asset managers next to my desk faster than the idea that they were going to have a particular certificate that they didn't know where to find, otherwise they weren't going to be able to transact this property. So it had absolutely nothing to do with the sustainability of the asset, but the fact that they couldn't transact it, that gets them totally excited about it. So yes, MEPS has been very impactful. It won't necessarily, as I say, it won't necessarily change the quality of the assets, but if we go with the sort of trajectory that that DEC is mooting, that it will be kind of gradually ramped up, and you do need to make sure that you've got the right certificates in place, then there will be a programme of upgrading assets. And certainly for us as a business, we look at, we need to understand what we refer to as our EPC risk, as most listed companies do now, property companies do now, and investors and funds, they need to know their EPC risk, so that you've got a programme in place to make sure you're upgrading those assets and taking that risk away. There may be various different ways in which you would do that, but we need to understand it. So, and that's created a lot of sort of latent wins. So it's created a lot more information, a lot more understanding amongst the asset managers and the property managers. And, we have hundreds of EPCs across the portfolio because there are hundreds of units from the shopping centre, and each unit needs one. So actually getting that information, as an industry, we're pretty poor, I think, the property industry, at really understanding the detail about how our assets operate. So it's pushed a lot more thinking and consistency about actually understanding how those assets are operating. So that's had a big impact. CRC has had a big impact, and again, there's an awful lot of bitching about CRC. It's complex. It's kind of a Kafkaesque in its kind of method in many ways. It's great for lawyers, which is always bad. You know it's bad.
You know it's bad.
No, it's certainly had a lot of detractors. But it put carbon on the boardroom agenda in a way that nothing had done before. And that has made a huge difference in terms of just suddenly, well, there's something my director has to sign, and he's not going to sign it unless he knows that it's been kind of, calculated properly. So all of a sudden you've got an agenda and you've got an audience and somebody wants to know what's happening. So yeah, it's driven much better quality data on the assets. We understand it better. To some extent, it's a relatively small group who are responding to it. So not, by no means. I mean, I did a breakfast in Bristol a few weeks ago, and the people were asking questions there about, I'm an advisor to a relatively small investor who doesn't understand, isn't interested in this, just hasn't started dealing with it yet. There's a whole tail in the industry of property owners, landlords, occupiers, operators who just don't see any of this stuff yet. So quite how we get to that, and there's an awful lot of emissions coming out of that stock.
Yes.
So the fact that our 12 shopping centres in the UK will be much more efficient, there's an awful lot of other stuff out there that isn't, which also needs to be dealt with.
Louise, just picking up on your long tail of people there, we've talked today about the disconnect between people and the environment at one stage. And one of the things I find in retail is it's 6 degrees out there. There will be some retailers who are trading with their doors open, and we're worried about energy efficiency. Can I have a comment on that?
I have had conversations with about this particular issue with Valley Retail, who run Bicester Village. We're a big investor in Valley Retail, and they run Bicester Village. And their policy is they will have the doors open. The doors will be open on all of those stores, and they are outside. So they are very keenly aware that there's a big issue. This is quite controversial because you're just arguably heating the atmosphere. And they have concluded, and they've done a lot of work on it. And there was actually, it was interesting because I don't know if any of you are familiar with GRESB, the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, but they did publish some innovation case studies this year. And Value Retail's case study on having their doors open was one of the case studies that they published. Because they've concluded with a good quality air curtain, if you've got a decent air curtain in, for them, given the number of people who are coming in and out of those stores, and believe me, there are a lot of them all the time, at Bicester Village, with the number of people coming in and out, they're better off having a very effective air curtain and their doors open than they are with the doors being open and closed all the time. So it depends, I suppose. It does depend on the environment which you're working in. Other retailers, H&M, I was talking to about it the other day. They door close policy. And where they're having a huge number of people coming in and out, they will have the doors open and their air curtains on. So it's not as simple as saying if you've got a retail unit, you must have your doors shut. Otherwise, you're heating the atmosphere out. There's a lot more to it than that. But yes, on the face of it, you think, oh God, why can we? They must have the door closed. The other issue is a lot of probably shouldn't tell you this, but a lot of our retail malls, we've gone to naturally ventilated mode now on them. Largely because we get free cooling from the units because they have the doors open. We have issues with the actual malls. We put circular doors, obviously rotating doors and things, and revolving doors on the malls. You will always have an argument with your asset manager about having doors on the malls because you're going to stop people coming in. It's more difficult to get in. So there's a design issue around it, and there's an educational piece around getting people to understand that the mall itself, you need to be able to control the air coming in and out. And then you have design issues about wind tunnels and all sorts of. So it is a tough one, but I think there are other areas. I mean, we did quite a lot of behavioural stuff over the summer. We had a big roadshow in all of our shopping centres, which was our first real consumer. We don't do very much consumer-facing work, obviously. We did a big consumer-facing roadshow in the summer and asking people about what were the drivers around their retail purchasing decisions, and to what extent is ethical and environmental issues. Ethical ones, actually, in terms of their behaviour, in terms of what they're buying, ethical ones are actually higher at the moment than the environmental ones are. They want to know where what they're buying is coming from. That was really interesting. Environment's very much up there. Obviously, price is top, but ethics, environment come above brand and marketing in the research that we did. But yeah, it's a very tricky one. It's a very challenging one. The open doors policy.
I think it's fair to say, particularly when you've got an accent like mine, that 2014 was quite an interesting year when it comes to politics in this country. And I've heard with interest, obviously, the comments about the level of political involvement of the populace. I suppose the question is, moving forward and looking at next year, where there is quite a large opportunity for another coalition government, and then moving forward into potential for greater devolution within not just the UK, but actually within England itself, whether or not you would regard greater devolution, particularly within England, as, and if that was to come to bear, whether that would be a help or a hindrance towards achieving, the aim of most in this room of, greater sustainable development and a greater push of the green agenda?
An almost impossible question to answer, I think, because it really would depend on the nature of the devolution that occurs within England. Whether it's just English votes for English MPs, in which case there's probably no real difference. But if you were to devolve responsibility for consenting and permitting issues or for environmental standards to different regions, then I guess that could be unhelpful to developers who would not know what was going to apply in different areas and what the different political views would be. But devolution wouldn't necessarily involve devolution of those matters. So I think you just have to wait and see. But it's certainly an issue that should be discussed while people are thinking about what is devolved and the nature of any devolution.
One of the challenges that we face in the industry is the way in which things are approached, uncertainty around standards and approaches, even across different offices of the regulatory bodies at the moment. And because of the way the regulators are set out, the way those are organised, I think from my point of view, it would be a lot easier for all of us if we all knew exactly where the playing field was. And the more complicated we make things, to be fair, the more money consultants will make in a way, because you'll have specialists and we'll all move around. Swings and roundabouts. I like the idea of local government in a local area, but I can also see that there are some potential problems for business and actually for environmental protection if you do get areas where the standards are lower, or the funding of those agencies are lower. Actually, you can get away with more in that area. Not necessarily where I want to be, but it could be a problem.
My name is Dorte Johnson. I work for Atkins. It's back to the open door sort of question to Louise. I actually also have worked in building services, and one of the things that, having been born and grown up in Denmark, and then I come here, that always I just do not get it, is that when you go into the retail shops, that what you're saying is that there's no cover over all the refrigeration units. So there's a lot more refrigeration required of all of those retail units. I mean, if there's any energy waste anywhere, then surely that's it. And I do not understand that there's no legislation, nothing in place. Because I remember whenever I go home or to Denmark, it's like 10 or 15 years, everything is covered. There's no kind of just refrigerant of everything around you. What are you going to do about it?
I could not agree with you more. There was a very interesting study actually that Waitrose did with BCSE ran. Waitrose, I think, were a part of it.
They were too.
Which looked at all of they looked at the energy consumption from the operational side of retail. And yes, refrigeration, absolutely. I mean, it's massive. And I cannot understand why certainly the supermarkets just don't simply have all of their fridges shut. And in fact, my local Tesco, just to bring this down to a really real level,
local level,
has doors on its fridges, but I go in there periodically and find they've all been clipped open. So I go and unclip them all. Being the way I am.
They must watch you coming in.
They do. And I started snarling at the manager about why these things are like, Tesco, really, you need to save the money right now. So, this is important to you. I cannot understand it. It's not an issue that we because we don't run the interior store, so it's not something that we would have any particular control over with our retailers. But I absolutely agree. Complete madness as far as I'm concerned, not to have those fridge doors closed at all times and the freezer units and everything else barking.
I can add a little bit into this, not from my professional career, but my background as from a
Fridge
family of
salesman.
retailers, surprisingly. What we found was for a number of two of our shops, we actually bought new fridges which came with no doors at that time. We've actually retrofitted them, and it didn't make any difference to the amount of beer that was sold. I think if
Well, that's
people want
exactly
it
the energy
enough,
use.
given it's now 1:15. It did make a difference to the energy, though, actually, getting those curtains back on there.
Thank you ever so much to our panellists, Louise Ellison, Simon Clennell-Jones and Euan McVicar, and thank you also to all of you for your interesting questions and for staying. I'm conscious I need to hand back to James. I think we've had a very interesting day. We've got an interesting time ahead of us, 6 months' time, the election, of course, tomorrow, the autumn statement. And I think probably what I've taken from today is that we really do need a cross-party consensus to be able to deliver a truly consistent and coherent environment policy. So I shall hand you back to James, but thank you very much to our panellists.